Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the controversial 1962 court case Engel v. Vitale. This legal dispute reformed the views of religious practice in public schools.
A New York state law required public schools to open each day with the Pledge of Allegiance and a non-denominational prayer in which the students recognized their dependence upon God. The prayer was as stated, "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country."
Supreme Court Justice Hugo L. Black says it is no part of the business of government to compose official prayers. It violates the students' First Amendment rights. However, they did have the option to opt out of the prayer.
A group of parents, led by Stephen Engel, challenged the practice. Engel sued the school's principal, Vitale. To them, the prayer violated the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion."
The group of people gathered by Engel consisted of parents, the ACLU, and the American Ethical Union. Engel's group first protested in front of the student school, Herrick's Union School District. He hoped that protesting would make the school district stop the coercion on students and prevent further making people uncomfortable.
They appealed this case to the New York Court of Appeals, which ruled that such state-composed prayers in public school violated the First Amendment's Establishment Clause.
The 14th Amendment says, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens in the United States." So the 14th Amendment applies the First Amendment to the states as well as the federal government. The majority of courts stated that the provision allowing students to absent themselves from this activity did not make the law constitutional. The purpose of the First Amendment is to prevent government interference with religion.
Since Americans adhere to a wide variety of beliefs, it is not appropriate for the government to endorse any particular belief system. The majority noted that wars, persecutions, and other destructive measures often arose in the past when the government involved itself in religious affairs.
I don't think the students were the only ones who were contravened. The teachers were forced to lead their students in their recitation of the prayer. Not every teacher is religious. That's just not fair.
Justice William Douglas said, "Once the government finances a religious exercise, it inserts a divisive influence into our communities."
The Supreme Court, in a 6-1 decision, found that the state's role in composing and recommending prayer was a violation of the separation of church and state.
This ruling established that public schools cannot compose or promote official prayers, regardless of their neutrality or optional nature, as it forces the government into the business of religion.
Engel v. Vitale is widely viewed as one of the most unpopular decisions in Supreme Court history. Rodney K. Smith wrote in his study on public prayer, "Public furor with the Engel decision was without equal in any prior Supreme Court case."
But that's not fair. Students should still be able to practice their faith shamelessly without being judged. Some of them can't afford to go to private school or their parents don't approve of it.
True, but even promoting prayer was a violation of the First Amendment. I agree, kids should be able to practice their faith without being judged. However, they can always pray with people of the same religion during breaks. People could have been seriously offended, not to mention the teachers had to guide their prayer regardless of their religion.
As much as people were offended by this, students should still be able to practice their faith without being told they can't. They should still be able to pray whenever they want instead of having to wait until a certain time.
Yes, but they can always say a prayer to whoever they worship. It was never said that the students individually couldn't. That's a First Amendment right. It's easy to find people of the same religion. I bet they could all pray together silently before classes.
Well, why don't the students see the prayer instead? They could form a religious group amongst themselves, so no one else would have to say the prayer if they didn't want to. No teachers or students could be offended since they wouldn't have to say or lead the prayer. Hopefully otherwise they have a tough crowd.
Agreed, that would avoid a lot of conflict and provide a safe space for religious students. However, if it was organized by the school and not the students themselves, that would still be a violation of the First Amendment.
But within each classroom, students could go off to a corner of the room or go outside to say their prayers so they can still practice their faith without offending anyone.
Think of it this way. If the school told religious students to pray to themselves and before classes so as not to offend anyone, that would be a violation of the First Amendment because it involves church and state. However, if the silent student-led prayer was organized by the religious students themselves, that would be free will and wouldn't be a violation.
Justice Potter Stewart was the one justice who dissented, and his reasoning was that the practice of school prayer was constitutional because it gave children the opportunity of sharing in the spiritual heritage of our nation. Engel v. Vitale is an important case because the Engel decision was a demonstration of how the court ruled in favor of individual liberties.
The prayer was composed by government officials as a program to increase religious beliefs. It could have been that all students were religious or tolerant of having morning prayer due to the fact that no requests to remove students from having to say the prayer were issued. Even so, when religion is forced upon someone, it typically drives them away and it causes confusion. It may not have been made clear that you could opt out of the prayer.
The New York State government's interest wasn't to increase beliefs, but rather use a moral education initiative to cultivate a sense of ethics among the students, which officials believed was essential to students' development and civic values.
That's still an issue. They're promoting religion. Teachers can always explain ethics and religion during history class. That would just be explaining rather than encouraging them to take part in religious practices.
That is true. They were promoting religion, but it reinforced the wall of separation between government authority and religious practice, as outlined in the Constitution. It aims schools to be welcoming the students of all faiths or no faiths.
Yes, however, it comes off as demanding that students participate in general religious practices. For people with bad religious experiences, that could really offend them. I mean, it's common knowledge that not everyone wants religion or is interested in hearing about it.
As stated earlier, they don't have to hear the prayer. They can still leave the room instead of having to say the prayer with all the other students. The students can form their own group to say prayers.
That's partially incorrect. What if a student had religious parents, however, the student themselves didn't believe in that specific religion? Then that student could opt out the prayer. I doubt their parents would let them.
But it doesn't matter because the Supreme Court ruled that state-sponsored mandatory prayer in public schools was unconstitutional. The court held that if a student is permitted to stay during prayer, the government cannot endorse any religion or force any religious prayer upon them.
True, but just because an issue was resolved doesn't mean we should forget about it. I'm glad that Vitale was brought to justice. I don't know what he was thinking. If he really wanted prayer in his school, he should have worked at a religious private school.
True. We need to acknowledge how hard that must have been for the students. You can't just force religious activities upon students. The Supreme Court ruled it as unconstitutional for a reason. The Supreme Court has consistently ruled against mandatory religious activities in public schools in which violations can lead to court orders requiring schools to stop the activity.
What would you do if your child was forced to pray in their public school? At that age, children are figuring out who they are and probably don't have a good idea of their religious values. Honestly, I would start throwing hands.
I would say that they could absolutely opt out if they wanted to. I would tell their principal that they should not be forcing religion upon any children.
Agreed. Imagine how confused those kids must have been. First you get told you're free to practice any religion because this is America. Then the next thing you know, your school is promoting religion.
It's so unfair. You can't force children into religion. They should have their own opinions, especially since they are so young. They shouldn't have to make big decisions such as if they will practice religion. When I was younger, I was still wondering where the sun went at night.
You know, this is actually really interesting because the court of Kern County was actually discussing whether to post the 10 Commandments in public schools.
That's right. This decision followed a year-long debate and concern over potential lawsuits. The initiative wanted to display the test as historical, not religious, but faced significant legal and community opposition.
You know, it's funny how a lot of school districts are trying to incorporate religion into generally agnostic environments. Hey, that could actually be a help though. The first commandments have general rules for human decency, such as being truthful, not stealing, etc.
I agree. The 10 Commandments are vital for being an adequate person, even if you have no interest in religion. As we start wrapping this up, remember the importance of Engel v. Vitale and that you should never force religion upon anyone.
Well, this has been very interesting. Thank you for tuning in on this case, Engel v. Vitale.